5 years later, the fourth report said exactly the same thing. We are not living sustainably, and our failure to live sustainably is actually getting worse each year, because each year there are more of us, and each year we are on average consuming more resources per person and putting more pressures on the environment to manage our waste per person. Let me just give you one snapshot to illustrate that. We noted in the first report a comparison of Sydney in 1970 with Sydney in 1990. In that 20-year period, the population of Sydney increased by about 1 million, about 30%, which is worrying enough in itself. But equally importantly, all of the indicators of resource use per person, energy per person, material resources per person, water per person, even food per person, increased by 30% or more, and all of the indicators of waste produced, solid waste per head, sewage per head, if that's the right denominator, all of those indicators also increased by 30% or more. So the total impact of Sydney on its surrounding hinterland was 1.3 times 1.3, which is about 1.7. In that 20-year period, Sydney increased its environmental impact by 70%. And the same's probably happened again in the 20 years since 1990. Every year there are more of us. In fact, we have a rate of population growth that is more like a poverty-stricken third world country than an affluent country. It is higher than any other OECD country. And our rate of consumption per person is still increasing. For example, we now have the largest new houses of any country in the world, worse even than the USA. In terms of climate change, I noticed that we still have the odd elected senator, and I use the odd word advisedly, who thinks that climate change is some sort of international hoax constructed by the United Nations to bring about world government. I don't think it were true. And just to remind you of the data, the 1980s was the warmest decade ever. The 1980s was warmer still, with every year warmer than the 1980s average. The first decade of the 21st century was warmer still, with every year warmer than the 1990s average. And the trend has continued. 2014 was the warmest year ever, until 2015, which is the warmest year ever. And 2016 is significantly warmer than 2015. In fact, every month of the last 12 has been the hottest of that month ever recorded. So it's starting to look like a bit of a trend. You think even One Nation senator might have noticed by now. And as well as the indicators like average temperature, the Arctic sea ice is shrinking rapidly. There are a whole range of biological indicators of change. The habitat range of plants and animals is changing. I was speaking to a vintner in McLaren Vale recently, and he told me that there's a bit of fluctuation from year to year, but on average the vintage has been getting 1 day earlier every year for the last 30 years. So they're now harvesting their vines a month earlier than they were 30 years ago. There's a whole range of physical and biological indicators of change, and the Paris Agreement represented an international decision that we were going to take climate change seriously and try and do something to slow down the process. And the Paris Agreement said we want to ensure that the increase in average global temperature from pre-industrial levels is no more than 2 degrees and ideally no more than 1.5 degrees. And I remind you, we've already achieved the first 1 degree of that, so we've only got a half or 1 degree still to go. In terms of putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, what the Paris Agreement effectively means, the 2 degree guardrail means no new coal mines or coal-fired power stations anywhere ever. The 1.5 degree guardrail means some of the existing fossil fuel use needs to be phased out before the end of its projected economic life. It means quite fundamental change. So if, for example, a Commonwealth Minister were to say we're serious about meeting the Paris Agreement, but we're going to approve the largest open-cut coal mine on the face of the earth, the kindest thing you can say is that the Minister has not been well advised The most unkind thing is that the minister is trying to ride two horses that are going in separate directions at the same time, and is so obsessed with economic development that he's prepared to approve a development that we know cannot be sustained in environmental terms. In terms of where we are on the map, when Donald Horne wrote his book, if you studied a foreign language at school, it was French. If you studied a second foreign language, it was probably Latin or perhaps German. It certainly wasn't an Asian language. Well, things have changed, and today there are about as many school students studying Asian languages as European languages. But to put that in the other perspective, there are still as many studying European languages as studying Asian languages. In other words, our language education, pathetic as it is by international standards, is still as much oriented towards our European past as our Asian future. I can only think of one recently elected Australian politician who could hold any sort of serious conversation in any Asian language, whereas many of our elected politicians could hold some sort of conversation in French or German or perhaps even Italian or Spanish or Greek. And even those who study Asian languages usually learn almost nothing about the complex history and social fabric of the countries to our north, about China or India or our nearest neighbour Indonesia, still less countries like Vietnam or Thailand or Korea or Japan. We are still largely ignorant of the Asia-Pacific region of which we are part. Donald Horne said that Australian politicians tend to make general statements about Asia in a way that even the most ignorant politician would not make about Europe. Almost any elected politician understands that there are some minor past tensions between France and Germany, or between Spain and Portugal, or between Italy and Greece, but they make blanket observations about Asia as if it were a homogeneous whole. And he said that we tend to regard the Asian region as an economic machine out of which we can make a buck, somewhere that we can sell our minerals, somewhere we can buy the things we're not clever enough to make for ourselves. And I think that's probably still true. And I think we should also think about the perceptions of our Asia-Pacific neighbours in our foreign policy and our defence strategies. We don't seem to think what our Asian neighbours might think of Australia when we mindlessly follow the USA into whatever is their latest military adventure in what we call the Middle East, even though from here it's the far northwest. I remember when there was serious discussion by the Howard government of Australia adopting nuclear power, it didn't seem to occur to anyone to think about why Iran's neighbours were worried when they saw a resource-rich country embracing nuclear power, and what, say, Indonesia might think if they saw a resource-rich country like Australia deciding to go down the difficult and expensive path of nuclear power. Would they really think it was about energy security, or would they think we had other motivations? One of our recent Prime Ministers actually said at a dinner in Jakarta that Australia was not part of the Asian region, which is an interesting new variation on geography. Whereas Donald Horne said in his later years that another one of our recent Prime Ministers behaved as if he had personally invented Asia and was solely responsible for explaining it to Australia. The fundamental point is we need to recognise where we are on the map, that we are steadily moving under plate tectonic forces, but only at about 5 centimetres a year, so we have to accept that we're going to stay part of the Asia-Pacific region, and in fact, under plate tectonic forces, we are moving north, so we're actually getting closer to Indonesia and China every year. So we should see that as our long-term destiny. In terms of our economic future, Donald Horne said that the Australia in which he grew up was a rather stupid place that exported minerals and agricultural produce to pay for the things we weren't clever enough to make for ourselves. At the time, manufacturing was 22% of the Australian economy. And we didn't just make cars, we made light aircraft, we made television and radio equipment, we made footwear and clothing. Today, manufacturing is 6% of the Australian economy. We're about to close down the car industry. We basically don't make even such primitive products as sand shoes and t-shirts. We now have, in fact, the smallest manufacturing sector as a percentage of the economy of any OECD country. It is smaller than industrial giants like Luxembourg and Ireland. We have basically deconstructed our manufacturing sector by embracing the ideology of free trade and the market. So in the short term, it is cheaper to buy produce from countries where people are paid $5 a week to make them, rather than pay what we would regard in Australia as a living wage. But in the long term, that means that we don't have significant industrial capacities. And I heard somebody arguing quite recently that if we were ever in any sort of conflict with other countries, we'd be seriously compromised by the fact that we can no longer manufacture for ourselves the sorts of things that we'd need to defend ourselves. Donald Horne said we needed to invest in education and science so that we'd be competitive in the 21st century. In fact, we've steadily run down public science, and public funding of science is now at the lowest level for 30 years. And the current government seems to want to turn CSIRO, which was once regarded as a model of public good science, into a second-rate consulting organisation by reducing its budget and forcing it to earn more and more of its income from short-term work for the private sector. In terms of tertiary education, I believe that a fundamental problem we face is that the Dawkins reforms effectively reframed education from being a collective investment in our future by ensuring that our young people were educated, to being a private investment in people's capacity to make money. So the fact that education ceased to be free and became something which incurred a HECS debt meant that people had to think about what their capacity would be to repay that debt. And if you look at the statistics, there's been a very significant transition from when the Dawkins reforms was introduced, away from science, away from engineering, away from the humanities and arcane areas like mathematics, which don't obviously lead to remunerative jobs, towards medicine, law, commerce, marketing, the financial sector, areas which, at least in principle, to the impressionable 17-year-olds look like areas where they'd be able to repay the debt they've incurred. And as one example, I saw recently the Academy of Technology and Engineering lamenting the fact that Australia graduates about 6,000 engineers a year, and there are about 18,000 new jobs for engineers each year in Australia. So we were only able to continue building roads and bridges and tunnels and ridiculously large buildings in the CBD of Brisbane because 2/3 of the new engineers employed are being imported from overseas. We are simply not investing in our technical capacity for the future. I noticed the other day a little list: Sweden, Norway, Finland, France, Germany, Brazil, Chile. Can anyone guess what those 7 countries have in common? Free tertiary education, that's right. Because in all those countries, educating your young people to the limits of their ability rather than the limits of their parents' wallet or political clout is still seen as the best possible investment in your future. Talking about our future more generally, Donald Horne said we needed to have a conversation about what sort of country we wanted to become. In the 1980s, we had a Commission for the Future, which was set up by Barry Jones. And its motto is, the future is not somewhere we're going, it's something we are creating. And I spent a year away from Griffith University directing the Commission for the Future. And its job was to remind people that the future is not deterministic. It doesn't unfold according to the inexorable laws of physics, still less what are improbably regarded as laws by economists. At any given time, there are a wide range of possible futures, and which one eventuates will be the product of our decisions and actions as individuals, as members of households, as members of communities, as members of organisations. our conscious decisions determine what sort of future we have, and that's true of every country. As one specific example, Barry Jones recently pointed out that at the end of World War II, Australia and Sweden both had a population of 7 million. Today, Sweden has a population of 9 million, Australia has a population of 24 million. Now, whether you regard that as a good thing or a bad thing, it is a significant difference that is a result of a whole series of political decisions. In fact, you might remember that the Howard government was so alarmed by the fact that our so-called natural increase, the annual difference in births and deaths, was only about 120,000 a year. They decided to offer financial inducements to women to have more children and to promote that with facile slogans like one for mum, one for dad and one for Peter Costello. And whether it's causal or not, the natural increase in births and deaths in Australia is now 150,000 a year, which is very unusual for a developed country. We have effectively bipartisan agreement at the national level to see population growth as good because it seems to produce economic growth. And at one level it does, of course. If you have 2% more people, then you sell 2% more food and 2% more clothes and you need 2% more housing. And politicians can say the economy is growing by 2%, aren't we doing well? But in fact, if the economy has grown by 2% and the number of people has grown by 2%, the income per person has stayed exactly the same. A few sectors are better off, like retail and housing and land speculation, but the community as a whole is no better off. And Barry Jones was arguing when he was Minister for Science in the 1980s that we should have a rational discussion about population, whether we think the population can increase forever or whether we think it should be stabilised, and if so, at what level. In demographic terms, the current trajectory has us on target for a population at the end of this century of more than 60 million. And if you're concerned about 24 million, you should be petrified at the prospect of 60 million. But there are economists who think 60 million is great. 60 million people out there consuming, the economy will go gangbusters. It seems to me there should be at least a conversation about it, not least because there's now a fair amount of evidence that all of our major cities are struggling to provide the increasing infrastructure needs of the growing population. And the simple arithmetic that shows why that's happening. The average lifetime of built infrastructure is about 50 years. I mean, some of it lasts longer, more like 100, some of it only lasts 30, but 50 is a good working number for doing a back-of-the-envelope calculation without an envelope. So in a steady state, your replacement bill for infrastructure will be about 2% of the total invested capital. If the population's growing by 2%, and the population of our major cities is growing by about 2%, that basically doubles the infrastructure cost. You need the 2% normal replacement plus 2% for the extra people. So the infrastructure bill is doubled by the current rate of population increase, but the revenue base has only grown by 2%. So in every capital city, governments are struggling to provide the transport, the power, the water, the sewerage that the community needs. And every 3 years the community says this government's not doing a good job and throws them out and elects the other mob. And 3 years later they say they're not doing a good job, throw them out and elect the other mob. But they are both facing the intolerable arithmetic that the rate of population growth, which is determined by the Commonwealth government, imposes burdens on state governments which they're unable to meet. Writing in 1964, Donald Horne said that it was inevitable that Australia will become a republic. The only question is when and on what terms. And that seemed a reasonable conclusion in 1964. You might remember that John Howard basically sabotaged the Republican movement by the old British colonial tactic of divide and rule, of exploiting the division between those who wanted a directly elected head of state and those who wanted it appointed by the Parliament. And so the 30% who are happy with head of state being the eldest child of the current British monarch prevailed over the 70% who didn't. But at some point I believe it's inevitable that we will become an independent country, and the embarrassment of having the Union Jack on the corner of our flag will be removed, and we will elect our own head of state. But the more important issue about our future, I think, is whether we see the Australian population stabilising, what we see as its sort of balance, and what we see as our role in the world, whether we see ourselves as an independent country, or as I think John Howard unfortunately said, the deputy sheriff, whose role is to be the United States of America's patsy in this part of the world. All of these problems need to be put in the context of the global future, which is also, I think, quite problematic. I'd remind you that in 1972, the first report to the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth, was published. And limits to growth was largely misrepresented by the media in a very similar way to The Lucky Country. Limits to growth was portrayed as a naive, oversimplified picture that we were going to run out of resources or suffocate in our own wastes. What Limits to Growth actually said in 1972 was that if the then growth rates in population, resource use, industrial output, agricultural production and pollution were all to continue, the world would reach limits within 100 years, i.e. by 2070. And the most likely result would be a sudden and irreversible decline in social, economic and environmental conditions in the middle decades of this century. They went on to say that none of those trends was inevitable, and it is entirely possible to redirect the trajectory of human development onto a path that would be sustainable into the distant future, but it would require conscious decisions. And they said if we wanted to have a sustainable future, the sooner we decided to pursue that path, the more likely it was that we would succeed. About 5 years ago, Dr. Graham Turner of CSIRO did an analysis looking at growth rates in those 5 parameters since 1970, and he concluded that all of those growth rates have continued from 1970 to 2010. So if we want to achieve collapse in the middle decades of this century, go right on, fellas, you're right on target. The point is that we cannot grow forever in a closed system. That sooner or later we need to recognise the limits of natural systems and try to find a way of meeting the needs of the entire human family within the limits of natural systems. There have been various thoughtful economists, and that's not an oxymoron, there are thoughtful economists, although the number could probably be put on 1 or 2 hands, who have been arguing for decades now that at some point economic growth has to stop. And I like Herman Daly's image. He said, you can either assume that growth will go on forever until the growth economy crashes, or you can try to redesign it. And he uses the metaphor that an aircraft has to keep going. It has to have airflow over the wing to stay in the air. But a helicopter can hover in one spot. And he said, we're currently running the world economy as an aeroplane. It needs to keep moving. It needs airflow over the wings to keep it up. But we know that can't go on forever, so we should be thinking about how we redesign it on the helicopter model so it can hover in one spot. There are a variety of studies. Herman Daly wrote about the no-growth economy in the 1970s, and Peter Victor, who's at the University of York, Toronto, wrote an interesting book called Managing Without Growth, which looked at a variety of futures for Canada. And I think that's particularly significant because Canada is the OECD country that most closely resembles Australia. Similar colonial history, similar sort of population, similar sort of geographic limitations, and similar sort of economic model, which is basically selling commodities to pay for the things it doesn't make. And he concluded that assuming growth would continue will lead to catastrophic outcomes within 20 years. Stopping growth today would lead to catastrophic outcomes next week. The only outcome that looks desirable is one in which the population is stabilised and then the size of the economy is stabilised at a level that can be sustainably supported. And he said that's physically possible, but it requires conscious policies rather than trusting the magic of the market. I haven't very often in my life quoted a Pope with approval, but I found myself in the book quoting Pope Francis's recent encyclical Laudato Si as saying, I think quite significantly, that a sustainable future has to rest on 2 pillars. recognising the limits of natural systems and meeting human needs within them, and a commitment to social justice so that the resources of the earth are shared more equitably than we are now. In facing the problematic future, I think Australia has a range of advantages over most countries, and I think we could be a genuinely lucky country. We are one of only a small number of developed countries that is essentially self-sufficient in important resources. The only other three I can think of are Canada, Norway and New Zealand. And Canada and Norway have the misfortune of sharing boundaries with larger and more aggressive neighbours, but Australia and New Zealand have quite a large moat separating them from their neighbours, so we have a much greater capacity to plough our own furrow, to develop in a way that we want to without concede to our neighbours. We also have what Donald Horne described as some great qualities as Australians. Now you might question whether these are universally held or unique to Australia, but he argued that we have in Australia traditions of tolerance, of fair play, of regard for nature, of adaptability, of scepticism, of courage, adaptability, stoicism. And I think there are some good illustrations of that. For example, the 2014 budget was widely regarded in Australia as unfair, even by those who benefited from the unfair changes that were being made. And the proposed attack on penalty rates was opposed even by people who've never earned a penalty rate in their life, because we felt as a community that it was reasonable that those who work on weekends and public holidays to provide essential services should be reasonably compensated for the time away from their family. So I think as an island nation with those sorts of capacities, we have a greater chance than most countries of moving to what would be a sustainable pattern of living. We still have a good base in science despite the recent erosion, and we still have strong social institutions, and we have enormous renewable resources so that we could certainly supply all of our needs from renewables. There's even a recent study that says that within 15 years we could electrify the transport system, we could build high-speed rail linking Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne and run that on renewable electricity. We have enough renewable resources to meet all Australia's needs hundreds of times over, but it's chastening that with the sunniest nation on earth, we rank 20th in the world in terms of the amount of electricity we get from solar panels. That well-known solar paradise, the UK, ranks third. That should be a national embarrassment. I mean, the interesting thing is that the community has moved, and 1.5 million Australian households now have solar panels on their roof. That's happened just in 3 or 4 years. The community has moved on, but our governments are still largely out to lunch. The final point I wanted to make is that the Australian Academy of Science did a study recently looking at alternative futures for Australia, and what they found was a strong consensus for an Australia that would be, quote, more caring, more community focused and more fair than the Australia of today. And I think that's really interesting and heartening, that if you ask individuals, they don't think that the economy is the be-all and end-all. I mean, they don't sit perched anxiously on their chair to see what the Hong Kong stock market did today or what the world price of copper did. They recognise that strong social institutions, a strong social fabric, and an inclusive community is more important than the gross domestic product being a bit more gross. So if we're going to be a genuinely lucky country, we need to recognise the limits of natural systems and be committed to live within them. We need to construct our social organisation so we respect those limits, and we need to see the economy as a means to an end, a means to achieve those social goals rather than an end in itself, a monster that must be fed. I still think that we could live sustainably in Australia. We could be a model for the rest of the developed world, and we could be a beacon of hope for the less affluent countries in our region. but it requires conscious choices rather than the current obsession with the market, the mindless pursuit of growth, and integrating us into a globalised economy that doesn't give a rat's about the future of Australia, that only cares about the profitability of large corporations. Just a final point, last year I became a grandfather for the first time, and looking at my precious little granddaughter and thinking about average life expectancies, I realised that she will probably live till about the end of this century. And I couldn't help worrying about the sort of Australia that she will live in. Those of us who were born around the middle of last century in Australia were extraordinarily lucky in the lottery of life. We've grown up relatively comfortable, relatively secure, relatively free of worry, relatively free of violence. And I believe that we need to repay that luxury that we've enjoyed by investing now in the decisions that will allow our children and our grandchildren to have the sort of quality of life that we've taken for granted. Thank you very much.
So we've got a little more than half an hour, but that was fantastic. And since I'm Elle and I are convening this event as a fundraiser for the Climate Council, I get the privilege of asking the first question. But then we're going to throw it open. You're going to have to project a bit, maybe stand up, and in an orderly fashion we'll take questions from the floor and have a bit of a discussion. But my question, Ian, is I thought you must have, given someone who thinks globally and is aware of the global environmental situation as well as the Australians, you must have struggled a little bit in parts of the book with the concept of country. I listened recently, earlier on this year, Paul Ehrlich was on the Q&A, and in relation to a question about asylum seekers, made the comment that he believes that all borders are immoral. What they're there for is to protect privilege and to make sure that people who are worse off stay worse off, and that people who are wealthy stay wealthy. Now, I'd be interested to see, to hear your view on that, in view of you've just painted a picture of how Australia could be a model, like some of the Scandinavian countries, and yet we're not just Australia. And there's a cost to preserving our privilege and our wealth. So, what's your answer to that?
Hope you gave him a heads up.
I remember seeing a cartoon that showed a politician at the lectern saying, "That's a very important question that demands really sophisticated evasion." I'm not going to try and evade it, but it's a very complex question. And I used to tell all my students of the aphorism by the American H.L. Mencken, who said every complex question always has a simple answer and it's always wrong. There is no simple answer to the question. I mean, we need to recognise that national borders are temporary. They're the result of past power struggles. And it's interesting to look at maps of Europe at different times and see how those borders have shifted as power struggles have gone on. And it's also clear that the nation state is no longer a sensible basis for organising the human community. And the United Nations, I think, is a model of undemocratic organisation of which Bjelke Peterson would have been proud. Yes. The idea that China, with 1.3 billion people, has one vote the same as Tuvalu or the Holy See. It's clearly ludicrous. I agree with George Monbiot, who's argued that at some point we need to recognise that the decisions about problems like climate change, loss of biodiversity, need to be taken at a global level. Problems about sharing of resources and food security should be taken at a global level rather than every country playing beggar my neighbour. And for that to work, you need some sort of global parliament. And you can imagine how this might work. You could say the largest size parliament I know that works is the House of Commons in the UK, and that's about 600 people. So a global parliament of 600 people would involve about one representative of every 10 million people. So Australia would elect 2 people, China would elect 140, India would elect 100, the USA would elect 30, and so on. And you could imagine a future model of governance in which there was a global parliament with about one representative for every 10 million people, and an upper house which is like the current UN General Assembly, in the same way as we have a protection against the tyranny of the majority in our 2-chamber electoral system in Australia. The founding fathers, and I use the gender word advisedly because they were all men, were worried that in a country where New South Wales and Victoria had more people than the rest of the country put together, if you had a single chamber parliament, then everything would be done to suit New South Wales and Victoria. So they built in a disproportionate representation of the other states by having an upper house where every state had equal representation. And in principle, the upper house is meant to act as a state's house and ensure that there's not a tyranny of the majority. So you can see a model of global governance in which there was an equally representative chamber and an upper house to ensure that China and India didn't gang up and run the rest of the world. I can't see that happening in a hurry because, well, I can't think throughout history of many leaders who have voluntarily relinquished power, even if it was obvious that their holding of that power was an injustice. I mean, it's like the problem of our federal model in Australia. It's clear that if we started again, you wouldn't have a model in which you had states like Queensland and Western Australia and a national government and local government in which there were some shires like Brisbane, which has a larger population and a bigger budget than the state of Tasmania, and shires like Birdsville, which have 125 people. I mean, it's a loony governance model. And I can't think of any national country the size of Queensland, still less Western Australia, that doesn't have a federal system of government. Because Queensland and Western Australia are far too large to be administered efficiently as a single unit, particularly if you're stupid enough to put the capital right down in one corner rather than somewhere in the middle. I mean, you might remember when Bob Hawke tried to change the constitution, the organising argument against it in Queensland was Canberra's too far away from Brisbane to make decisions for us. Just for devilment, I got a map of Australia and drew on it an arc with Brisbane as the centre and the Brisbane-Canberra distance as the radius. And more than half the population of Queensland and about 2/3 of the area is further from Brisbane than Brisbane is from Canberra. So if Canberra's too far away from Brisbane to make decisions for us, why are we making decisions for Bamaga or Mount Isa or Cooktown? It's crazy. If we were starting again, I think you'd have a model in which you had regions which would be bigger than our local government areas but much smaller than states, and a national government. But what chance is there of state governments voting themselves out of existence to have a more rational government model? So I can envisage a more rational model, but I have no idea how we could possibly get to there from where we are.
All right, I'm actually going to have a follow-up question too. I know there's a lot of other people would like to, but it's going to be very brief, and that's you've just pointed out that there are some fundamental problems with representative democracy.
Yep.
The point is, we vote for someone. About half the people in that area are represented in some way, perhaps by that person, but we've actually got no real idea of what they're going to, what their belief system is, what they're going to actually do in terms of voting. So it seems to me that the fundamental problem is representative democracy, not that we need to sort of tinker with it and make it work better, but that actually we need, with the ability now, with blockchain technology, which is the ability for people to vote directly on issues that matter to them, why do we even really need a representative democracy? Because people can have direct democracy if they take it.
Well, I'm sure we could. I mean, one of my cynical colleagues used to say if voting could change anything, they wouldn't let you do it. There are clear problems with representative democracy, but there are also problems with unrepresentative non-democracy. I spoke recently about these issues, and a young man from Vietnam came up to me and said, well, you know, you're complaining about how bad your politicians are, but at least you have a chance of throwing them out. We don't. Now, at one level, it's possible for a benign dictatorship to take wise long-term decisions in the interests of the community. An example is the one-child policy in China. That the leaders in 1980 said that it was better to have the social pain of restricting people's right to have children in the short term, rather than have what they saw as the inevitable cost of mass starvation in the 2020s. And they now say the political pain was considerable. Look, there are 400 million fewer Chinese than there would have been if the one-child policy had not been adopted. The trouble with benign dictatorships is that they usually don't stay benign very long, and unaccountable dictatorships tend to become corrupt. I think there's a lot to be said for some sort of participative democracy, and I think if you allow people to make decisions, they generally make better decisions. I've given a few people the example that Mike Berwick reported to me. He was mayor of Douglas Shire, and he said Douglas Shire used to be proud of the fact that they had the cleanest drinking water on the planet. It was basically water from the Daintree rainforest. But Bjelke-Petersen allowed George Quaid to sell some blocks of land in the Daintree rainforest, so people started to live there, and there was a certain amount of unlicensed squatting, and they started to detect levels of E. coli in their drinking water. And since their only economic activity is tourism, they were worried that Douglas diarrhoea would join Barley Belly in the tourist lexicon and people would stop coming. So they decided they had to clean up the water. And he said, I faced an intractable dilemma. He said the cheapest way to clean up the drinking water would be chlorination. But a lot of people in Douglas Shire value their clean green image. And if I'd approved a chlorination plant, the people who valued the clean green image would have formed a pressure group and I would have been thrown out at the next election. He said there's cleaner technologies like microfiltration, but they're a lot more expensive. And the back of the envelope, some suggested I'd have to put the rates up 50% if I brought in microfiltration. And if I did that, a different group of people would form a pressure group and I'd be thrown out at the next election. But what he did was politically very clever. He said, this is too important a decision for the council to make. The whole community has to make the decision. So they commissioned engineering studies of 4 different water treatments, fat report in the council offices and in the council libraries, 1-page front and back A4 summary, folded up and put in every letterbox in the Shire, and they then sponsored an 18-month period of public discussion. There were debates in the town hall, columns proselytising for different options in the local paper, and they held a plebiscite in conjunction with the local government elections. And he said, I'm a Democrat, if I'm returned, I'll do what the community want. The really interesting thing is the community voted by a thumping majority for the cleanest but most expensive technology. And those who would not have supported that were prepared to live with it because they'd had their say. There'd been community participation, the community as a whole had made the decision, and everyone lived with it. And he said the really good news is that by the time they came to implement microfiltration, the technology had improved. They only had to put the rates up 20% instead of 50%, so everyone was happy. The point of the story, I think, is that politicians tend to assume that we want everything done on the cheap, that no one wants to pay taxes. But I don't know anybody who goes into a shoe shop and says, give me your cheapest shoes, or goes to a used car place and says, what's your cheapest car? Most of us recognise there's a trade-off between what you pay and what you get. And I'd like to see a political system in which there was a genuine discussion about how much taxation we pay and what it's spent on. Politicians assume that we want to pay less taxes, And most surveys find that most people would prefer to pay less tax. But they also find that most people would prefer better government services. They'd prefer better healthcare, they'd prefer better schools, they'd prefer better public transport and better roads. And what we really should have is a system in which we're offered options. You know, if you pay this much, this is what you get. If you pay that much, this is what you get. Not just in terms of the global sum, but also in terms of priorities. You know, is it really a priority to have, by 2050, 12 submarines to protect us against seafaring penguins? Or are there more important things the government could be doing with their money? I'd like to live in a society where there is a genuinely participative approach to these difficult decisions. I'm not holding my breath. Because it would require politicians relinquishing some of their power and saying, we're happy for the community to make this decision. But I think they'd actually be surprised by how responsible the community are if they were given the choice.
Yes.
This is a bit of a follow-on from Dean's question, but I first want to say thank you for tonight. You've articulated, pardon me? You've articulated things tonight that I've believed for a long time, and in such a way that is understandable and really easy to grasp. It was just wonderful. The 4 Scandinavian countries you mentioned that are on the top of the sustainable list have representative democracy. How did they achieve where they are, besides the fact they're quite small countries and quite well educated? How did they achieve something so different from what the rest of the world's doing?
That's a very good question. I mean, there's a long tradition of social democracy in those countries. They're well educated and they pay more tax than we do, and that means that the education system is well funded. They have better systems of parental leave so that women can participate more in the workforce.
But they made those decisions at some point too.
Yeah, and as a result, there are more women in elected positions so that their parliaments are more representative than ours are. They're probably, they also have commitments to process of involving the community. For example, my main area of research has been energy policy, and I remember following the discussions in Sweden about 2 apparently conflicting issues. There was increasing concern about nuclear power and a desire to see nuclear power phased out, but there was also concern about decarbonising their energy supply. And so they held a whole series of community meetings, starting at the town level, and then the views from the towns were fed up to regional forums, and then finally to a national forum. And they published a discussion paper and held a national referendum in which they gave people 3 options. One was to expand nuclear power, the second was to keep the level of nuclear power at not build any more nuclear power stations, but allow the stations that were currently in operation to continue for their projected life. And the third one was to close down the industry immediately. And the voting was something like 40% for closing it down, 40% for allowing the existing stations to continue for their projected life, 20% for having no limits. And the government interpreted that as saying 80% think we should not build any more new nuclear power stations. There's about an equal division between closing them down and allowing them to live out their projected life, so we'll take the compromise and let them live out their projected life. But that was a genuine community discussion that started at the village and town level and fed up to the national level. Now, we don't have an energy policy. In fact, I remember hearing a captain of industry saying that when he heard the phrase energy policy, he reached for his 6-gun. You know, as far as he was concerned, it was an affront to the market to have a policy that government should stand back and let the market prevail. And you see what happened. You see in the United States what happens when you let the market prevail. I don't think it's a pretty picture. So I don't think there's a magic formula, but the Scandinavian countries have been committed for a very long time to educating their community. They've also been committed to not growing rapidly. I mean, I gave the example that Sweden had 7 million people in 1945. They have 9 million today. That's meant that their systems have stayed manageable, that there haven't been pressure on infrastructure, and there hasn't been a rate of inflow of migrants that's caused any sort of social tension. But I think the critical thing is that they're committed to educating their community. I mean, we went to a conference in Finland and we noticed that the bus drivers in Helsinki spoke better English than some of our local bus drivers. And we inquired and we found that every child in Finland learns Finnish, Swedish and English. Every child. I mean, when I went to school, we were told that only particularly clever people could learn foreign languages. They just don't believe that. And nor should they, because people in Switzerland grow up speaking 3 languages. There's a commitment to education, and I think if you have an educated community, it's much more likely that you'll make rational decisions.
I was just
Oh, yes.
There was a review in the most recent issue of the New York Review of Books about a book talking about the 100 years, which covers the 20th century basically, which is saying that this was the period of growth. Up until 1870, between 1870 and 1970, growth had been stable for 10,000 years. And basically what happened with the arrival of the internal combustion motor, we had this extraordinary economic growth and we had these changes in technology. And the central thesis of the book, I guess, is that there is going to be no technological shift to match the technological shifts that happen within that 100 years coming now. We've had those, and the growth is going to go back again automatically to zero, and that we're going to have to deal with that. I just state that if you've got a comment on that.
Well, there's no doubt that the growth of the last 100 years is unique in human history. I mean, in 1900 there were 2 billion humans on the planet. There are now 7 billion. It's inconceivable that it could treble again in the next 100 years. Now, you can't imagine 20 billion people where we're struggling to support 7 billion. On the other hand, there's no doubt we could do a much better job of equitably supporting the 7 billion that live now. But at one level, people quite legitimately express concern that there are 500 million people who don't have enough to eat. There are 1 billion people who don't have clean drinking water. There are 2 billion who don't have sanitation. There are hundreds of millions of children who don't go to school and so on. I'd remind you that this is at least as much a political and ethical question as a technical question. The UN Development Programme did a study in about 2003 looking at what it would cost for a global program to ensure that every person on Earth, however carelessly they chose their parents, had the basics for a civilised lifestyle. That everyone on Earth had clean drinking water, adequate nutrition, reasonable shelter, basic health care, and education, including reproductive advice for women. And that would be a huge program, you know, given how many hundreds of millions, or in some cases billions, do not enjoy those luxuries now. And they concluded it would cost trillions of dollars per year. They then did another calculation and said it's about 5% of the global military budget. Or to put it another way, since they spend about as much as the rest of the world, about 10% of the military budget of the USA alone. And they made the comment that ensuring that everybody had the basics of being able to live in a civilised way would not require something as utopian as peace breaking out universally. It would only require shaving a small amount off the quite obscene sums we spend preparing to fight each other over limited resources to create a situation in which there was no need to fight because people had adequate resources. And I sometimes hypothesise that there might one day be a visionary president of the United States. It certainly wouldn't be Donald J. Trump, but a visionary president of the United States who concluded that they would be more secure if instead of spending trillions on weapons, they spent a fraction of that sum ensuring that they didn't have enemies, making friends around the world by giving all of the poor countries of Latin America in particular, which they regard as hostile, the basics of a civilised lifestyle. Now, I'm not sure how realistic that is. Well, I'm sure how realistic that is, and it's not a very good prospect. But the point is that we could do a much better job. In terms of our situation in Australia, and going back to borders, I mean, the fundamental reason people pay people smugglers and crowd onto leaky boats and brave shark-infested waters to get to Australia is that they are so desperate with the situation where they are that they are prepared to give everything they have and risk their life in the prospect of getting to somewhere where, by their standards, the streets are paved with gold. And if we don't want that to happen, I think we should be investing in the economic development and the empowerment of women in particular in those countries from which people are crowding onto boats to come to Australia. That I think is the best investment we could make in our security. And I think it should be a national scandal that we've never gone anywhere near the UN target of 0.7% of GDP in international aid. The last two budgets have cut our level of international aid to the lowest since World War II. And a lot of that aid isn't real aid, but sort of backdoor funding of Australian companies to operate in those poor countries in our region. If we were seriously interested in regional stability, we would be interested in ensuring that Indonesians and Malaysians and Thais and Cambodians had a civilised life where they are, rather than thinking that the highest goal in their life is to come to Australia.
And on that topic, you've just mentioned women again. You've mentioned a few times. At least half of the people here are women. The next, we've had 4 questions now from men. The next 4 questions are going to be from women. So who here would like to ask a question?
I'll be brave. I have a question. You touched earlier on the issue of the three-year term, which is something that I think we all struggle with. Is it realistic to think that we can achieve any of the things we're trying to long-term, or that the Paris Agreement has sort of brought us to agree to in this country with such an impediment? And there's no structure in place currently that would allow those decisions to be made outside that process?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think in principle there's more chance of long-term decisions being made in countries that have a 4-year term of government like the US or a 5-year term like the UK. In principle we have a 3-year term, but if you analyse how often we have federal elections, it's actually about 2 years and 4 months on average between elections. So governments are always in pre-election mode.
Plus caretaker and all that.
Yeah, and so they're never prepared to take long-term decisions. I would like to see a situation in which there were some things that were not politically contentious. And it seems to me that in the 1950s it wasn't contentious to have projects like the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme. It wasn't a political football. There was agreement that that was an investment in our future. I mean, I used to invite my students to reflect on whether if the Snowy Mountains scheme had not been built in the 1950s and were proposed in the 1990s, would it have gone ahead? And the answer is not a snowball in hell's chance. I mean, in the 1950s, the people of Adamini just packed up and left and allowed their town to be flooded. Today they would have been standing in front of the TV cameras waving placards, and environmentalists would have pointed out that flooding the alpine valleys was going to do significant environmental damage, as it has, and the reduction of the flow of the Snowy River to 4% was going to do irreparable damage to the ecological systems downstream, and the irrigation of the hinterland was going to cause problems of salinity, which it has. But at the time there was no disagreement, and in my deluded moments I could imagine projects like high-speed rail from Brisbane to Sydney, Canberra and Melbourne, with half a dozen regional stops between Brisbane and Sydney, between Sydney and Melbourne, having bipartisan support and not being a political football. But the current situation where we have a parliament with a majority of one, and an opposition who saw how they were treated when they had a perilous majority in the Gillard years, that really encourages a combative environment in which you oppose everything. And we have a rather depressing situation, I think, where politicians seem quite unabashed about opposing in opposition something that they proposed themselves when in government, or proposing when in opposition something that they opposed when they were in government. I mean, consistently doesn't seem to be part of the political lexicon. I'm not sure, I don't think that's just a problem of the short political terms. I think that's
It's the
a
political
general
process
problem.
which fails.
Yeah.
The decisions are always contentious.
Yes.
They're not actually representing the people, and they're not representing the long-term needs of the country.
Yeah. I think it's also a problem of the political culture that the two-party model means that the opposition's job is to oppose. And one thing that the Scandinavian countries and some other European countries have is they don't have a rigid two-party system. They actually have a multi-party parliament. And that's encouraged by the electoral system. I mean, I think there's something to be said for the Tasmanian electoral system, the so-called Hare-Clark system, where instead of single-member electorates, which are winner-takes-all, they have multi-member electorates. So, and their multi-member electorates are based on the federal electoral boundaries, so there's no chance of anybody locally gerrymandering the boundaries to suit political convenience. So the Tasmanian House of Assembly has multi-member electorates, each one based on the federal electorate, and each electing 5 members, so that there is a diversity of people representing your area in Parliament. And I think that's a much better model than the one where you have an electorate like Capricornia, where the Labor member was elected, I think, with a majority of 127 in an electorate of 90,000 voters. So 45,000 voters feel alienated. They didn't vote for the person who got in, and 45,000 did, more or less by the toss of a coin, get someone who represents them. I think the multi-member model is a much better one, because you get genuine representation of the diversity of the electorate. And I think the multi-party system, where no party has a majority and people have to patch together coalitions on particular issues, lends itself to an inclusive approach, rather than, we're in power for 3 years and sod you, we're going to do what we want. So I think, in some ways, the British system that we inherited is a wonderful legacy, but I'm not so sure we've done so well in inheriting the two-party model in which there's rigid fighting between two opposed parties. And I've seen personally in areas that should not be political, being disappointed from advisory bodies to which have been appointed by the previous government for the only crime of having been appointed by the previous government. That we got in, so now we're going to clean out this advisory body and populate it with people that we think are, what's a Humphrey called, sound chaps, in other words, people whose values are similar to those of the people who are in government.
Ian, I wonder if you could speak from there, please.
Oh, yes.
I have defective hearing.
Okay,
and
I have
sat
defective
here
speaking. So.
specifically so that I can hear you.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Jenny.
In those other democracies that you mentioned, is the political donation system as corrupt, I'd like to say, as it is here, where political parties are able to and gather funds from various industry groups?
And
Or
the
is it-
short answer is no. There are countries where political donations are not allowed, in which corporations cannot make donations to political parties.
Like in Sweden?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And I think that's a much better system, because I struggle to see altruism in the large donations of corporations to political parties. It does occur to me that they might sometimes feel that those bodies want something in return for their generous donation. Call me cynical if you will. But,
Especially when you get to see them out to both mountains.
well, that's right. So they're then in the position of backing both horses in a two-horse race. I mean, there's some other interesting aspects of the Scandinavian countries. For example, Finland does not allow private schools. There is a state education system and everyone is educated in the state schools. And I think that lends itself to a much more cohesive community than one in which there are separate tribes who are educated separately. I saw the extreme example of that when I was working in the UK, where in Northern Ireland there were still tribes, and it was clear from the way you spoke which tribe you were in. Because if you went to a Protestant school, you talk like that. And if you went to a Catholic school, you talk like that. So as soon as you opened your mouth, it was clear which tribe you were in, and that marked you for life. Whereas I think a system where people are educated inclusively lends itself to a much more cohesive community than one in which you can buy the privilege of education that gives you a better chance in life's lottery. Yes?
My question is why, we know that the Finnish education system is the best in the world, and the Scandinavian countries are way ahead in sustainability. I mean, why don't we learn from them? I don't understand why, and I keep asking this question and nobody seems to be able to answer it, because it's there, it's obvious, it's reported. Why don't the leaders ever take any notice of it?
Well, I'd answer with a question. How many Scandinavian programs do you see on television? How exposed are our young people to Scandinavian institutions and cultural precepts? I mean, essentially, I think a cynic could say we moved smoothly and seamlessly in the 1950s from being a British colony to being an American colony without ever being an independent country. And the decision of the Menzies government to make television commercial was effectively a decision to Americanise our popular culture, because it was much cheaper to put on the screen something that already paid for itself in the US and could be bought off the peg than something that had to be produced here in Australia. And the local content rules have steadily been watered down, so you see some British programming on the ABC, and there's still a remnant of programming from other cultures on SBS, but even there I think the introduction of advertising on SBS has made them much more cautious, because the advertisers want ratings figures to justify paying for the advertising. So it's become much less diverse, much more mainstream, and I think public broadcasting is an essential bulwark against political forces that we cannot control. And if you think we have a problem despite having the ABC and SBS, you should check out the USA, where there essentially is no public broadcasting and there is no media doing the sort of things that Four Corners has done in the last 4 weeks, of speaking truth to power and exposing things that those in power would not at all enjoy seeing exposed, which you certainly don't read about in the Murdoch press. We only know about them because we have public broadcasting.
I'm
So-
not going to stop you, but I'm going to change you to this chair. You can stand behind this lectern. There are some people who are struggling to hear.
So I mean, the way media is organised, I think, is critically important, because until we had the internet, mass media was the only way people got information about what was going on in the world. And I used to do comparisons between the USA, where television is totally commercialised and is essentially a tool of marketing. At the other extreme, countries like China and the former Soviet Union, where television was a tool of government propaganda, and the whole spectrum in between. In Australia, public broadcasting has about 20% of the market. In the UK, it has about 50% of the market. And that's because the BBC is much better funded than the ABC is. And one thing that concerns me is that every year the ABC's budget is reduced. And that means the ABC is constantly, I believe, looking nervously over its shoulder at what might offend a coalition government in particular, So, for example, on Q&A every week, there's somebody from the Murdoch Press or a right-wing propaganda organisation. I can only remember one environmentalist on Q&A in the last 5 years. Those voices just aren't there because the ABC is very worried about the limited budget it has and its capacity to do the important work it does. I'd like to live in a society in which our public broadcasters were better funded than they are today, and they had more security, where there was less political interference in the appointing of the board of the ABC and their managers. And it was done genuinely on merit and in a way that reflected the importance of the public broadcaster as a cultural institution.
Do you think the internet will change because people can go looking for information themselves now? Do you think that's a way that things may change?
Well, I think things have already changed. I mean, there are quite well-informed people who think we are seeing the last decade of print journalism because the newspapers appear to be in a death spiral where they are losing money, so they sack journalists, so there is less reason to buy the newspapers, so they lose more money, so they sack more journalists, so they lose more money. And there are quite well-informed observers who think that the newspaper will disappear completely. And more people today get their news online and get them by buying the Curious Snail or the Adelaide Advertiser or any of the other strange publications of the Murdoch Empire. And corresponding with that, they clearly have less political influence than they used to have and that they think they have. I mean, the Courier Mail campaigned robustly for the return of the Newman government. And people didn't listen, they threw the Newman government out. They campaigned robustly for the return of the Liberal government in Victoria, and the voters threw them out. I mean, there's not much evidence that the Murdoch press has the political clout that it used to have in the 1960s, where people would read the Sydney Morning Herald editorial or the Australian editorial. It appeared they genuinely had some impact on the way people voted. They can slant the news, but more and more people are getting their news from other sources, so they're having less and less influence.
You had a question?
Just following on a little bit from what Chris was saying, this is all very depressing, really. But Ian, you've been a lot closer to the centre of power than what any of us will ever get, probably, in terms of speaking to influential people and being on, various investigative groups. Do you see really any hope that we can move towards the sorts of changes that we all think should be happening, or do we just, live out our lives in our own little bit of bliss and just pretend it's not happening? Because I just can't see much hope of the kinds of changes that we know need to happen actually occurring.
That's a fair point. I mean, somebody said there's a fine line between pessimism and despair. And I think it's entirely appropriate to be pessimistic. In 2000, I was asked to give a conference paper on the topic, "Can civilization survive the 21st century?" And I said if you're a gambler, you wouldn't put stolen money on it, because we don't show any sign as a global community of recognising the scale of the problem, let alone having the institutions and the political will to deal with it. So there's no rational grounds for optimism. On the other hand, if you think you can't solve a problem, that becomes self-reinforcing. If you think you can't solve a problem, it doesn't get solved. If you think you can, you give yourself a chance. It may not be a great chance, but you give yourself a chance. And I'm an incorrigible optimist. I mean, that's a psychological condition that I struggle with. I mean, I'm the sort of cricketer when the other team is known for 120 chasing 150 is still saying, if we get a wicket, you never know, things could change. Because I've played long enough to have played in games where things did change when you got a wicket and people panicked. And it's not just the cricket world, but human systems generally are non-linear and can change very rapidly from one stable state to another. You might reflect how in 2007, within about 3 months, John Howard went from being unassailable to being unelectable. People just stopped listening to him. And by the time of the election, I said that I think if he'd walked across Lake Burley Griffin, people would have dismissed it as a pre-election stunt, and they would have voted him out anyway. They had just stopped listening. Human systems can change quite rapidly from one stable state to another. I mean, in the long term, if you think about how changes like the end of slavery or votes for women were affected, they didn't come about because of visionary leaders. They came about because small numbers of determined people worked for change and changed the community mood so that the old approach was unsustainable. That's ancient history, but you might reflect on how rapidly attitudes have changed towards smoking in shared space, or driving while drunk, or same-sex marriage. Extraordinarily rapid transitions.
There have been fairly powerful lobbies that have supported those causes in different ways.
Well, there's very powerful lobbies that supported the tobacco industry and supported the alcohol industry, and there's a powerful lobby that will die in the ditch to stop same-sex marriage. But I think that game is essentially over. And I used to remind my students that all of the people who've proposed significant changes were seen as ratbags and were seen as advocating something that was utopian. The abolitionists were told that it was utopian to argue for the end of slavery because no economy could function without slave labour. It was bullshit, but it was the received view that they struggled against. The suffragettes were told, and you can still read the speeches by the whiskered patriarchs in our state parliament, that society would crumble if such unreliable people as women were allowed to vote every 3 years. Well, that's ancient history, but I also remind people that only 30 years ago, it was still utopian to be dreaming of Berlin without the wall, or South Africa without apartheid, or an African-American US president, or women leaders in government in Australia, or even such modest innovations as good coffee and civilised licensing. In every case, the changes happened because the community mood changed. And the optimist in me says there has never been a better opportunity for people who understand the problem and understand what needs to be done to organise. Because when I grew up, the only people who could mount sophisticated propaganda were very large corporations and governments. They were the only ones who had movie cameras, they were the only ones who had printing presses. Today, any activist with the arse out of their jeans can mount a propaganda campaign that will bring a government to its knees. And we've seen that in a whole range of campaigns in this region to stop inappropriate developments. So, you know, I think we should be hopeful. We shouldn't be naively optimistic. And I said earlier, power is rarely surrendered without a struggle. But slavery did end. Women did get the vote. We did get good coffee in Queensland. I believe that I want to be able to say to my young granddaughter that we were trying. You know, when she says, "What were you doing about climate change?" I want to be able to say, I wrote books, I wrote newspaper articles, I wrote letters to the paper, I ear-bashed members of parliament, I spoke to public meetings, I went to freezing halls in Mullaney on a Friday night. That I did what I could because I understood the problem. I mean, I think we will be asked in future the sort of, you know, what did you do in the war daddy type questions that our parents were asked. And I'd like to think that we'll all be able to search our soul and say, we were part of the struggle. We were doing what we could. We may not have succeeded, but by God, we tried.
I would like to keep going too, but we actually are going to have to wrap up fairly soon. But before we do go, there's the job's not over. I mean, I don't know if you feel as frustrated as me, but there is incredible discontent. Some surveys that have been through Twitter and so on have said that there's record levels of discontent within the populace at the moment with the way governments are working and not representing the interests of us all. So if anyone is really interested in this, we'd really love you to put your name down on the form at the back, and we'll stay in contact so that we can actually, what I would really like to do is to get those people who are passionate and interested in direct citizen democracy and making a difference to the really big issues of our time, like climate change, which if we just let our governments go on doing what they're going to do, which is business as usual, the reef is going to be, like, it's already major damage. It's just going to be stuff. And it's not just the reef. I mean, we're looking at existential crisis, I think. I don't want to be too alarmist about it, but it is pretty major. So I think anyone who is really passionately concerned about this, put your names down. I'm really optimistic that things are going to change because there's a convergence of technologies now that are going to enable people to actually have their say directly and bypass essentially the obfuscation and rubbish that is dealt us from our political system. So I would like to, anyone who's interested in tapping into that, blockchain technology and direct democracy, having smart voting and actually having your say about issues that really matter to you, then, you know, look, please let us know. Some of you, we have your email addresses, and so anyone else who wants to get involved, put your names down. The other thing is that Rosetta Books have about 30 books here. I hope they're going to reserve one for me.